Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Manchester is Red podcast on the middle Monday of the international break. A relatively quiet week, but as with Manchester United, there is always something going on. I'm Tyrone Marshall, hosting today, joined by a refreshed-looking Samuel Luckhurst, who is back from a week off and raring to go. Samuel, we've been talking about this, so I'll make you repeat your answer again, but did you have a good week off?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Indeed. Yeah, it was relaxing. It was fun. And from the outside looking in, it didn't seem it was too hectic covering United for once, which I think we have Mr. Barada and Mr. Ashworth to thank for that after our little briefing with them on the Sunday afternoon, a few hours before the Liverpool result.
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely made a difference and kept it a quiet week. And I mean, the subject of that briefing was Erik ten Hag and his future. Obviously, you just spoke to them before the Liverpool game and the 3-0 defeat. We've since ran a survey that people may have seen on the website and responded to, two of which the questions were about Ten Hag. 66% say he's not the right man. 68% say he won't be here at the end of the season. Samuel, it's fair to say that he is back under some pressure at the moment, isn't he?
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. I think those stats there, those from the survey, they are reflective of the reality. That's quite a hefty portion who don't think he is the right man. And look, the way these things work are that if you have a good win, if you win a game, then that question, it's going to be probably 68%, maybe more, saying that he is the right man had they beaten Liverpool. I think there was some poll post-cup final about how many wanted to keep him. But as I said last week, I think the whole situation with Ten Hag and keeping him, it's been a really good example as to why supporters should not run an elite football club, because they're too easily swayed by emotion. And I remember when we were walking out of Old Trafford after the Liverpool game 8 days ago, you were saying about in terms of who could come in, and like clearly they are very conscious, the new power brokers, of fan sentiment, given that they ended up keeping a manager who they were fully intending on sacking until United had that phenomenal FA Cup final win. But we've both said our piece on whether he should have been managing United this season or not, and the situation that United are in, that we're in terms of covering Ten Hag's situation, was totally avoidable had they just brought a new man in, which is what I thought they should have done. I'm never going to change my mind on that, even if United were to somehow win the league under Ten Hag. If that was the case, you hold your hands up and you say, congratulations, what a phenomenal achievement that is, what a phenomenal story that is as well. But I suspect we won't ever see that day. And with approval ratings, that's how it works. Keir Starmer's starting to notice it as well, where he's prime minister. It's a very different entity when you're in the limelight, when you've got the top job, as is the case with him in politics. And Ten Hag has got one of the biggest jobs in sport at United, and his approval ratings are always going to fluctuate depending on the results. And again, I think it's a strange one going back to that cup final, because this is me, I suppose, being consistent with my view, but in a way that performance and the manner of United's victory that day, it almost was another reason to actually change manager, because this was a manager who was banging on about, I've not got the right players available. And then when he has got every player available, it's all about a squad game. But the fact that they reached the level of performance that they did that week, it should have told you that was not a reliable gauge of United's performance level last season. It certainly wasn't for last season. And were they ever likely to keep that up coming into this season? I think looking at the terrain, looking at their preparations for the season, it was always going to be a tall order for them to replicate the performance level of an FA Cup final against their closest and one of their greatest rivals, and salvaging that season, and also stopping their rivals from doing a double. Their incentives are plenty in going into that game, and of course qualifying for Europe was another one, which was an absolute bonus, given that although they don't want to be in the Europa League, they'd rather have European football than not have any European football. So I think we're coming away from that game, that going back to May, and a hell of a lot has happened since then. But I think the sense was still that Ineos had to make that managerial change, but maybe, you know, have a respectable amount of time and allow him to toast that phenomenal victory. But then, of course, come the Monday, there was clearly a shift, and then it just seemed like there was a lot of face saving going on until they did communicate in a pretty dubious way the decision to stick with Ten Hag. And I know people will say he's only had 3 games and you can't judge him on 3 league games, but we're not judging him on 3 league games. We're judging him on 12, 13 months worth of work now. As we've always consistently said, the league form is the ultimate litmus test of you know, a manager's performance level or a team's performance level. And United have lost 16 out of their last 41 Premier League games, which is staggering, really. And I think what history tells us with the sackings of Manchester United managers, most of them, is that when they have sacked the manager, it has been too late. They've left it too late. I thought, and look, I can refer people to the piece if they really want to, but I thought David Moyes before Christmas, it was pretty obvious that he was not up to it. I never thought he was up to it anyway, but there were a couple of results that they had in December 2013 where I thought, now's the time to do it. They were never going to do it back then. Louis van Gaal should have gone around Christmas time 2015. He went at the end of the season. The one which broke precedent with the whole, you know, let's wait until we've not qualified for the Champions League until we sack him, was of course with Mourinho. And I didn't agree with the timing of that sacking. I can understand why they did, and of course they had a phenomenal, I'm using that word again, phenomenal, but the first 3 months under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was a real prolonged honeymoon period. And with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, even though it wasn't like they were leaving it months and months and months, but certainly it was 4 or 5 weeks too late, because he should have been summoned the day after that 5-0 thrashing by Liverpool to Carrington and told, right, that's it. But there were complications there because they were caught short. They'd given him a contract in the summer, which was pretty laughable, really, given that he was never going to be in demand. This is a manager who's not managed in nearly 3 years. And then they didn't have a succession plan at all. And that's how poorly run United were back then. And with Ten Hag, certainly if Coventry had beaten them in April, I don't think he'd have been managing that next game against Sheffield United a few days later. And it was quite funny after the recent Liverpool defeat. There was someone, some kid clearly, who tweeted a screenshot of the VAR from that day that denied Coventry what would have been one of the most astonishing FA Cup wins. Just saying, I think the caption was, "This is why Ten Hag still has a job." And when you boil it down to that, you think, yeah, it is pretty preposterous that he's still managing United. But ultimately, that is pretty much why he is still in a job. It's because VAR intervened to ensure that Coventry didn't make it an all light blue FA Cup final.
Yeah, and you know, whatever you think of the decision in the summer and the rights and wrongs with it, and as we said, there was a decent split, and certainly United fans, I think, were in the majority, probably the overwhelming majority at that point, to keep him. It's the one decision, the one area that Ineos have kind of erred since they've come in on the football side. They clearly changed their mind on it. They were clearly going to sack him before the cup final. They changed their mind, but they spoke to other candidates. Everyone knows they spoke to other candidates. There was then talk of building up this trust, getting a new contract, then only getting the option taken. And it does feel like this decision and sorting out the manager, for all the good they've done in the transfer market, for all the good they've done in putting a structure in place, this is the real test for those decision makers now, isn't it? And you know, we've all seen what Dan Ashworth and Omar Barada said in the pieces that you've done from that sit down. But getting this decision right is a big call for them. And how long do they give it? They have to get that right, and they just have to be firm-footed. If they did make a mistake in opting to keep him in the summer, they need to rectify that as soon as possible, I guess.
Well, one of the interesting takeaways from our chat with Barada and Ashworth was that both of them repeatedly stressed, and quite logically, that their official start dates were in July. Ashworth starts on the 1st of July, Barada starts on the 13th of July. So officially, they had nothing to do with the decision to keep Ten Hag or extend his contract by a year. Unofficially, I think we all know that they'd have been dialing into the back channels or having surreptitious discussions with the power brokers at United about their plans. I don't think Dan Ashworth, he turns up at Carrington on the 1st of July, and then it was 3 days later, wasn't it, that it was announced that they'd extended Ten Hag's contract. Like, there's no way he would have been informed 3 days before that decision was communicated that, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to just extend his contract. I think he'll have been kept in the loop, but of course, due to legal reasons and the garden leave and what have you, officially those two had nothing to do with it. And so for those two, their hands are washed clean of that decision. They've washed their hands of that decision. So it makes it easy for those two when, and I think it is a question of when rather than if, when the time comes to change manager, that's their trump card, if you like, for the chief executive and the sporting director, because they're going to be the two key decision makers when the time comes to decide that it's time for someone else to occupy the manager's office at Carrington. And they said what we expect they would say about having full backing for Ten Hag and that they've enjoyed working with him. But United have changed almost everything at the club, or Ineos have changed almost everything at United this year. But the key change they've not addressed. And that's because of peer pressure, really, because of supporters wanting Ten Hag. Oh, sorry, I should say the majority or a lot of supporters wanting Ten Hag to stay after the FA Cup final. And that's a key change as well, and worth raising. You go back to that post-match press conference at Wembley after they beat City, and a lot of colleagues got a lot of. I wasn't. You were in that press conference, weren't you? I was in the mix zone, and I don't think you, but because I think your question was a little bit different. But there were a lot of very difficult questions posed for Ten Hag because of his situation, and quite rightly so. And everybody knew that the press conference was going to go in that direction. But a lot of colleagues got a lot of stick and abuse from some who actually want to attend press conferences as well online over their interrogation of Ten Hag and their questioning of Ten Hag. And then you bear that in mind, and then you go to the recent post-match press conference after the Liverpool defeat and the plaudits Ian Laderman rightly got for essentially enlightening Ten Hag of where United are going wrong, because Ten Hag didn't seem to agree with the fact that they do resemble the same side of last season. And it was Ten Hag getting stick over his press conference performance after after a pretty robust but fair exchange between him and Ian. And Ian had asked a question of him. I think it was the final question at the cup final post-match press conference, where I think Ten Hag said to him, you have no football knowledge, or you know nothing about football. So this was the sequel, if you like, because Ten Hag said to him after the Liverpool game, I feel sorry for you, which was just like complete nothingness. This was a man there who had run out of ideas, run out of rationale, and had run out of responses to some very difficult questions posed of him. But the fact that United fans were actually, a lot of United fans, as far as I could tell, were applauding the journalist there, spoke volumes. And if you look at what opposition fans are saying about Ten Hag's performances in press conferences, it's like, how the hell are United tolerating this guy? Because he is saying some very delusional things at times, which are unbecoming of a Manchester United manager. And in some ways, press conference performances for managers are more important than their touchline performance, because you can't watch that from start to finish. Yet fans will go onto YouTube, they will go onto news websites, and they will watch a press conference in full to see how the manager has conducted himself. And Ten Hag is really, really struggling in press conferences at the moment, chiefly because he keeps on banging on about winning 2 trophies, as you and Steven touched upon on the second podcast last week. And it's beyond belief, really, that someone at United has not advised him yet to stop going on about these 2 trophies that are in the distant past now. The first trophy was won in a season where they finished above Liverpool in the Premier League table. So he's actually, if anything, he's flagging, oh, this is how good we were in our first season, and look at how bloody bad we are now. But he's got to put an end to that if he wants to stay in charge of United, because it's winding fans up to high heaven. We're asking him questions where we actually know what the response is going to be at times, which is another problem altogether. So come Thursday at Carrington, he's really got to project a new image when he attends his pre-match press conference for the Southampton game. I suspect he won't, because he really needed to project a new image on I think it was the Tuesday morning after the semi-final farce against Coventry. And he called the reaction to United going from 3-0 up to drawing 3-3 against Coventry, surviving a disallowed goal and winning on penalties. He called the reaction to that embarrassing. It wasn't embarrassing whatsoever. And then he made a factual error when he said it was the first time they'd ever reached successive FA Cup finals, when it wasn't. The first time they did that was in the 1950s. The first time, it was that, and they did that in the year the Munich air disaster happened. So to make a factual error on top of it, and when managers do that, that's because they're scrambling and they're starting to feel the pressure. And he has had a hell of a lot of pressure to deal with in the last year, and I don't envy him that whatsoever. But it's an occupational hazard in managing Manchester United. You are going to be under constant pressure. The pressure is never, ever really released when you're in charge of United. So it'll be interesting to see how he comes across on Thursday, because he does need to project a new image.
Yeah, definitely. We did speak about that on Friday, and he definitely needs to change the way he conducts himself and approaches press conferences and what he says in press conferences. And like you say, Thursday will be the first one of this run, and these 3 international breaks at the start of the season, September, October, November. International breaks are always a dangerous time for managers. If you're thinking of making a change, they're an obvious change, an obvious time to make a change, given there's then a run from November till March, really, where the action is non-stop. So it feels like there's a good chance we're going to be discussing exactly the same things in October. There's 7 games now between the September and October international breaks, 4 of them in the Premier League. Southampton, Palace, Tottenham and Villa. I mean, are you expecting more of the same? They probably need to win 5 of the 7, maybe 4, probably 5 of the 7, given the cup games, for us to not be really speculating about his future. And I mean, they are capable of that, but do we expect them to do it?
This is the problem with United. You don't know what you're going to get from them. We go to games and we're flying blind. We don't know what we're going to be served up by them. And probably halfway through the first half against Liverpool, we thought, actually, we do know what we're getting served up here. We're getting served up another thrashing to write up. That is the familiar United that we encounter at times these days, and that's been the case for the last year. But I mean, with the Europa League, you can finish 16th and you're still in it, because that means you get that playoff to qualify for the last 16 of the quarterfinals. I can't remember which. I'm still trying to keep up with the new format. But of course, it's the top 8 who qualify automatically for the next the next knockout round. So the Europa League games, unless they lose both of them, which I don't think they will, you can kind of discount them. It's got to be based on the league form. Yet this is a club that did not judge the manager on the league form last season. Sorry, they judged him on 1 game out of 52, and United tried to present it as like they took this into account, they took that into account over the whole end of season review, which lasted 17 days, and they essentially drew conclusions that had been concluded long before the season had ended. So there's no getting away from it. They judged the manager last season on 1 game, and that was, of course, the FA Cup final. And that was why it was a wrong decision, because they had to judge him on the league form, and the league form was so bad, it was their worst season in 34 years. And they've not made a good start to the league this season. There was some progressive strides made against Fulham in the way they were playing, and to an extent Brighton as well, even though they lost. But from about the 79th minute onwards against Brighton, we have been reacquainted with a familiar United, which is the United of bad game management, bad substitutions, an added time defeat, and a 3-0 home drubbing, whilst looking gettable, whilst not having any midfield shielding. That is the United we do expect, unfortunately. And I don't think we'll get that United against Southampton. I just don't think they'll lose that game. I mean, famous last words, but you'd like to think, and this is how low the expectations are at the moment, but you'd like to think United would beat a team that were promoted in May via the playoffs. But beyond that, yeah, it's Crystal Palace away, which was the nadir of last season. It's Tottenham at home. Tottenham played very well against United at Old Trafford last season. Villa away. United did the double against Villa last season, of course, but Villa still finished 4 places better off than United. And also Villa in both of those games, they certainly at Old Trafford, they threw it away. At Villa Park, I thought Villa were the better side overall, but they just weren't clinical. And it was during that run where it felt like United regained momentum and they were on the charge as far as top 4 was concerned. But if say they were to, the ultimate doomsday scenario would be 4 defeats. I don't think they'll lose those 4 games. But if they were to lose to Palace away, Tottenham at home, Villa away, then we've got the October internationals. It would be remiss of the club not to sack him. But even if they have a good run of results now over the next month, all it does is just extend the trial period. And that's all his contract extension did. It just extended the trial period. And that's why it was the wrong decision to keep him in the summer. They were changing everything at the club, it felt like, apart from the manager. And as I said last week, Sir Jim Ratcliffe in particular, because he's gone on record as saying it, he has underestimated the importance of the manager's role at United. And it was also noticeable that Barada and Ashworth, they both repeatedly referred to Ten Hag as the coach because they want that to be the role. If that's the case, then you should have got a coach in, and they didn't do that. They decided to stick with him, and it's already looking like they're on a sticky wicket.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be a very interesting and very busy month. That is all for the first part today. We'll be back after the break to discuss transfers again already and look ahead to that Southampton game. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. There might be some uncertainty over the manager's position. Ineos yet to put their stamp on that, but they've put their stamp on pretty much everything else around him. The structure has changed remarkably, really, in the space of, 3 years at least, and even going back a little bit further. It was only March 2021, I think, when they finally appointed a football director in John Murtagh and a technical director. Only May 2022 when they got a deputy for Murtagh in Andy O'Boyle. Before that, it was Ed Woodward and Matt Judge doing the transfers at Manchester United, and you look at it now, and it has changed out of all recognition. It looks like a proper big football club now in terms of that structure, and a few changes last week. O'Boyle leaving, which I think was on the cards, given his job title was a deputy to a job title that doesn't exist anymore. Christopher Vivell staying as interim director of recruitment until February at least, and Sam Erith coming in as interim performance director until the end of the season. Erith spent 11 years at Manchester City and very, very highly rated there. Again, it's an example of United going for this best in class under Ineos. And when you look at the structure around the manager or the head coach now, whoever that may be, they appear to have the right building blocks in place, don't they?
Yeah, obviously I've been off, but there are a few interims in there. Do you know why that is?
Vivell is interim until February. I think at the moment there's probably an expectation that'll be made permanent, but I think Ashworth is still trying to work out exactly what he wants from this structure. Vivell decide whether he actually wants to stay in Manchester long term. I think there's probably an impression it's going to get done, but not quite a guarantee from either side. With Erith, I think it's the same, but not entirely sure, to be honest. That is until the end of the season. But get the impression that they're still not quite sure, Dan Ashworth, exactly what structure he wants. I think one of the reasons O'Boyle left is that essentially other people were doing his job now in terms of Ashworth and Wilcox. And I think they want to make sure that they don't end up with a structure where other people are treading on on toes. I mean, you've seen it at Chelsea, haven't you? You look. I mean, Vival's probably a good example. He spent 7 months at Chelsea and then left because there was so many chefs there that nobody quite knew what everyone was trying to do. And I think they probably want to avoid that kind of issue where you end up with two people doing a pretty similar job.
Indeed, and I mean, in the case of O'Boyle, that was it's a difficult time for a lot of people at United with the redundancies, but with the greatest respect to him, his role was a redundant role because, as you said, there's not a football director there anymore, and the way it works with Ashworth as the sporting director, he's overseeing pretty much the club as a whole. So he's overseeing the first team, the academy, and the women's team. Jason Wilcox, as the technical director, has that first team remit. So Ashworth said to us that he's the one who works closest with Ten Hag on a daily basis. Nevertheless, when Sekou Kone, the 18-year-old they signed on deadline day, when it came to his unveiling picture, he was sat with Wilcox, who of course was the academy director at Manchester City before he moved to Southampton last year. That said, United people at United said to me that they don't see Kone as an academy addition. It sounds like he's going to start training with the academy, make his debut for the under-21s, and eventually transition to training with the first team. So it'll be fascinating to see how his progression, how he gets on over the next year or so. But I mean, it did need a proper restructuring, and we all knew this was going to happen. And although there were times when we would see Sir Dave Brailsford in conversation with John Murtough, I don't think any of us expected John Murtough to be at United for the long haul. And so it came in March or April time that he tendered his resignation. But they needed people there who have got experience of managing at the highest level, and clearly Barada's fingerprints are all over this, because that must be what 2 or 3 appointments now. Even Toby Craig as the chief director of communications coming over, having previously worked at Manchester City as well, and from what I understand, he has a very tight and good relationship with Barada. You can see where they're going, and look, if I don't think there's any shame in United looking to people who have worked at Manchester City, and if they're up for working for Manchester United, fine, go out there and get them, because as you touched upon earlier, it is pretty perverse when you think about it that they did have Ed Woodward and Matt Judge running the show for all those years as far as transfers were concerned and contract negotiations were concerned. And it's not difficult to see why they got so much wrong during their time there. And as a colleague said the other week, it's telling that certainly the case of Woodward and Richard Arnold, they have and they do occupy new roles now, but they're not in football. And I think it would be a real surprise if they were to ever get roles in football again, because they're not football people. They didn't exactly distinguish themselves in the running of the football clubs. Arnold was a better chief executive than Woodward during his short time, but that was, of course, blemished by the appalling way United handled the Mason Greenwood saga with their own internal investigation and the U-turn they were forced into there, where fan power won over. But it feels like United, and I think Ashworth said this to us, it's about putting the pieces in place so that they've got the right environment, the right setup there to have a successful era. But I come back to that decision that they bottled in May and June, which was the manager's position, and they've kept the manager. And okay, it's still early in the season, but as I said earlier, we've got no axe to grind with Ten Hag. His first 12 months, we waxed lyrical about, because he deserved the plaudits for overseeing a really good first season. But it feels like watching United that this season is becoming an extension of the chapter of last season, when really United must have hoped to close the book on the 23-24 campaign, because of, Ten Hag's been on record as saying it himself how bad a season it was, given that they finished 8th in the league and finished bottom of their Champions League group and didn't even have any European football to play after Christmas. So it's all very well having this new structure in place, and I'm sure there'll be a few more parts that are moved here and there, and the training ground is being kitted out as well for £50 million, so that they've got a better environment. And I listened to your podcast on Friday about the change they're making, and how would you rate Ineos so far? Was it very pleased or quite content? And I agree with you in terms of it being quite content. I think that's perfectly fair and reflective of the start they've made, and there are good intentions there regarding the stadium, regarding Carrington. I think long term they will want to move to a new training base, but it's each step at a time. And of course, the stadium is going to take precedence, and of course they need to ensure that the first team are competitive and in the right, are in good nick as well. Unfortunately, at the moment they're not, but you only have to look at the history of Manchester United to see how a manager has defined their most successful eras. And yes, the game has changed a fair bit, but I genuinely think, certainly in the case of Ratcliffe, because he has gone on public, he's gone public with saying it, he has underestimated the manager's role at the club. Their most successful eras have been defined by Sir Matt Busby and Sir Alex Ferguson, and the chances are their next successful era will be defined by the manager, because Manchester City's hegemony has been defined by Pep Guardiola. Liverpool's Renaissance period it was defined by Jurgen Klopp. When Arsenal were a force to be reckoned with in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was because of Arsene Wenger, and the rebranding of that club was so drastic. You could have put an accent over the E in Arsenal because of the impact Wenger had on them. So, as Ratcliffe is an incredibly successful businessman, as we all know, but there are times where you need football people who've got the football knowledge to impart their wisdom and influence, and just kind of open his eyes to it, that you can't underestimate the manager's role. You might want to make him the coach. You might want to have a sporting director, which is absolutely the right thing to do. And they've got a brilliant choice in Dan Ashworth. They've got clearly in Jason Wilcox, someone that's very highly rated and regarded, to elevate him to the position he's got. And they've got other guys coming in who are having their input. I mean, Barada mentioned, I think you might have met him. I haven't. Steve Walsh, who I don't think there's even a picture of him on Google Images. And I think he's the head of recruitment. So it'll be interesting to see what the dynamic is there, given that they've got a director of recruitment coming in, but he's still knocking about. So they've got all these very highly regarded people working in the structure, but you've got to have the right manager. And for some time, it feels like United have had the wrong manager.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, in terms of the structure, what you want from any one well-run football club is to be planning ahead in transfer windows. And you've done a story this morning that United are doing exactly that, looking at maybe strengthening in 4 key positions next year, and already monitoring someone who is probably one of the most exciting and watchable players in the Premier League when he's on his day, in Eberici Eze.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading, I think it might have been a few years ago, he did a really quite charming interview with Matt Dickinson at the Times. I thought he should go far, just going off the cut of his jib, and he has gone a long way to the point that he's valued at 60 or 70 million by Palace. Clearly, he stayed at Palace because they managed is the wrong word, because they'd been loath to lose Michael Elise, but they sold Michael Elise to Bayern Munich for £50 million, which I thought was a knockdown fee that Bayern were getting him for. Whenever I've watched Eze in person, I've enjoyed it. I mean, there was, in terms of covering United that night at Selhurst in May, I think, I mean, you weren't at the game because of the bloody accreditation issue, but I went down with Rich, and I think everyone knew as soon as the team sheets dropped that United were going to get beaten that evening. But because we're professional and we're coming the game, there was joy to extract from watching Eze, Elise, Adam Wharton as well that night. It was impossible not to be impressed by Palace, or enjoy the way Palace played football that evening. from a purist perspective, a completely professional purist perspective. It wasn't reveling in the downfall of Man United or anything like that. It was just appreciating good football played by good footballers. And it's got to be a matter of time until Eze leaves. I mean, Steve Parish has spoken on record before about the financial realities that Palace have to deal with. And you look at it now that Elise is gone, that the two players that top clubs will be looking at next year are Eze and Adam Wharton, who I was surprised he was omitted from the England squad, given the balance I think that he could bring to that midfield. Although they did absolutely fine at the weekend against Ireland, but long term, I think he'll be a very good player for England. And a few clubs probably looked at that piece of business Palace did in January and maybe thinking, cracky, should we have gone for him for £20 million? I remember thinking at the time, £20 million for a Blackburn midfielder seems quite extreme, but Wharton's probably worth 4 times that amount now. And Eze's worth a similar amount because he's a Premier League proven winger who's an England international, and he's in that England squad on merit. He's a brilliant player. He scored a brilliant goal against Chelsea the other week. Scored a brilliant free kick in the opening weekend of the season that, but for the referee's incompetence, should have stood. Whistle shouldn't have been blown, and I didn't think it was a free kick either. The foul was given, I think it was by Will Hughes on Nathan Collins. But you look at the state of play in United squad, and it's completely logical that they're looking at a winger for next year because they've got 2 raw assets there in Garnacho and Ahmad. Marcus Rashford has been out of form for a year. Anthony has frankly never been in form for United and has barely had a kick so far this season. His only appearance was as an 89th minute substitute at Brighton, and all I can remember him doing was conceding a foul during that cameo. Sancho's gone. So, a lot, of course, does hinge on how Rashford gets on this season. He's not had an auspicious start, although I think some of the stick he got during the Liverpool game was pretty harsh, given that he created 2 outstanding chances for Joshua Zirkzee. But even if Rashford has a good season, they are going to need another quality winger. And I even felt coming into this season that just making one attacking signing didn't suffice. But I think the reality of it, and we can kind of tell going into a window that how it's going to shape up. And it wasn't a surprise that they only made one attacking signing just because of PSR and having to get rid of players to bring players in, squad management size as well. And occasionally you have an eye on an academy player coming through, and Ethan Wheatley. Again, he was on the bench against Liverpool. There's a good chance that he'll get some minutes against Barnsley if United oversee or manage a rare routine win that night. But it's still an attack that does not have a dependable goal scorer. And Eze is certainly not that, but he's a dynamic winger who clearly looks ready to make that leap to a team competing in Europe, competing for a Champions League side. He is a boyhood Arsenal fan. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if he was to end up there either. I know Arsenal have got good options on the flanks, but obviously Leandro Trossard was of interest recently. There was a bid from a Saudi Arabian club, wasn't there? Will he be there this time next year? Possibly not. Then the prospect. If you're an Arsenal fan, you could have Eze on one side, Saka on the other, with Kai Havertz through the middle. I think he's developing into a really, really good attacking player there as well. That's exciting. So I don't think, I think that's another reason why United have really got to be in the Champions League next season. They have got to be able to have that pulling power so that players will look at them, top players or players who want to be in that top tier, and look at United and think, that's the place to be. And it's a stable structure. It's got the right manager in place. They're going places. Essentially, the position United were in the summer 2023, where it looked like they were a club going places, and then unfortunately it started to gradually unravel, and then it spiraled. But I mean, beyond Eze, they will need a centre back next year. At least one. Jared Branthwaite is still of interest, unsurprisingly, given that they looked at signing him in the summer, and you could still see them going back in for him next year, given that the way it's shaping up at Everton, they will probably need to get someone off the books next year who's going to fetch a pretty penny, and Branthwaite is the obvious player there. It's difficult, certainly at the time that we're talking, to identify another player in that Everton squad who's going to fetch a good fee. I mean, Dominic Calvert-Lewin's out of contract next year, so it can't be him. It's probably not going to be John Pickford, because there's not going to be a market for him, I wouldn't have thought. You look elsewhere in that squad, and there would have to be someone to emerge throughout the season to be more sellable than Branthwaite. Branthwaite is the obvious one. Left back is another area where United are looking at, and rightly so, given their two senior left backs are Crocs. And midfield, that I think we would all be absolutely stunned if United don't make another midfield signing next year, purely because Christian Eriksen is 33 and will be released in the summer unless he leaves in January. And Casemiro is also 33 in February, and unfortunately he's been in decline for around a year now, and there's absolutely no sign that he's going to be arresting that decline.
No, absolutely not. And to get back in the Champions League, they need to win games like Southampton away. That's the one coming up this weekend. At the moment, we're still in the heart of the international break, I guess you would say. A few goal scorers for United in internationals. Joshua Zirkzee getting his first for Holland. James Scanlon scoring for Gibraltar. Bruno Fernandes for Portugal. Looking ahead to Southampton, we will be back on Friday for a more in-depth preview. But I guess this covers the whole of that international break, or this spell between the international breaks as well. What Ten Hag could really do with is some players returning. You mentioned the left backs there. I think Luke Shaw's probably going to be more towards the end of this run of 7 games than the start. Rasmus Højlund, they could do with as well. That is going to make a big difference if he can get a couple of those key players back fit. And left back has been a constant issue, hasn't it?
It has. And look, I think Getty Images on Tuesday or Wednesday will be browsed quite closely, because that's usually the first day where United release a batch of training pictures of players post internationals. And if Luke Shaw is not visible in the training imagery or footage, you know there and then that he is almost certainly not going to be playing against Southampton at the weekend. And I mean, speak as you wrote and said last week, and it's the same for yours truly as well, in terms of speaking to people at United. They've kind of like preaching caution with Shaw. It's not going to be, he's going to be straight back after September internationals, even though that was what Ten Hag implied. But again, communication has been an issue for Ten Hag, and it is frustrating for Shaw. It's extremely frustrating for United fans that here's a player who's not played since February the 18th yet, got himself fit to play a few games for England during the summer, and then comes back first week of pre-season, suffers another new injury. I mean, I think if Shaw doesn't play on Saturday and Bruno Fernandes does, I think Fernandes is 38 appearances shy of Luke Shaw's appearances for United. And Luke Shaw made his debut for United in September 2014. Fernandes made his debut for United in January 2020. That gives you a gauge of, one, how robust Fernandes is, two, how brittle Shaw has been for a good portion of his time at United. And people cannot keep on going on about that horrific injury he sustained 9 years ago, because his fitness was a problem in the first season, and it's been a problem since he recovered from that horrific injury. He's had so many muscular injuries, and he's a player who's got to change his conditioning. He's got to be making as many adjustments as possible. So Dave Brailsford is all about marginal gains. Well, Luke Shaw needs to change his mattress. He needs to wash his hands differently from others. He needs, to have the right car, or get one of those. When we were in LA for the tour, we saw those robot cars going around, which was quite an unsettling sight. But even if it means resting his legs while his robot butler drives him to Carrington, so be it. So Dave Brailsford's this genius apparently on all these things. So get him doing all those things. But I think at this juncture we're probably expecting Mazraoui at right back and Dalot at left back again. Although I think Dalot has been inhibited by by playing there. I think that there's got to come to a point where you play your first choice right back at right back.
Yeah, I don't think it's getting the best out of Dalot at the moment. But like I say, we'll be back on Friday to look ahead to that game. But Samuel, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Tyrone, as always.
No problem at all. Do remember to leave us a like, subscribe as well to make sure you get the podcast in your feed. Like I say, back later this week to look ahead to Southampton. But for now, that's everything. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the international break.